Hello, we are delighted to be joined by Rob Neal OBE from the Department of Education. Rob is going to speak to us today about using staff networks to influence stakeholders. But before we continue, Rob is going to briefly introduce himself for the benefit of everyone at home.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you for those watching this. My name's Rob Neal. I work as a civil servant with the Department for Education currently, although most of my career now into its, 37th year. It's incredible. I have to pinch myself. It has been with the Ministry of Justice, as it's now called, formerly the Lord Chancellor's Department, and before that, the Court Service Agency. So spanning those 3.5 decades, I've worked as a civil servant, and in the last 2/3 of that time, doing much of my work in and around staff networks. It's not just a passion for me, it's become literally a way of working life.
Super, thanks so much for that, Rob. And you're going to answer some questions for us this morning about using staff networks to effectively influence stakeholders. And so my first question to you would be, how do staff networks help to drive business goals and contribute to organizational development?
Sure. Well, how do they contribute to driving those goals? Well, staff networks, in my experience, tend to emerge from oftentimes a kind of a perceived gap in the services that an organization are either offering its people, its staff, or indeed are offering those that they serve, their customers. In the case of civil service, very often we're talking about members of the community. And what you find is that people groups within the departments come together to form and create a safe space to share, to earth some of their emotion about what they face within the organization by way of turbulence and hindrance and challenge, so they can kind of get things off their chest. They can find a space to often heal and come again to offer their best efforts. So for me, the relationship in then helping to drive organizational goals is that you end up with a space and a place that individuals can renew and refresh themselves, their holistic health, their well-being, and repair their psychological contract with the organization in order to fully engage. And we know that employee engagement is a real driver of success, but to offer their best self and to come again with, whether it be, their best timekeeping, whether it be their considered thoughts around innovation and creativity, whether it be their best offer in terms of a presentation they might be doing, or a paper they might be writing, or a bill or a piece of legislation they might be developing. But because of their well-being being paid attention to through their time spent with the staff network, through speaking to like-minded, like-spirited others, they can find a way of deepening that sense of belonging to an organization that otherwise might have them feel excluded, otherwise might have them feel less than. Staff networks have a way of making you feel more than, of feeling capable and not othered, but actually to feel included. And I think a lot of that is hard to measure. A lot of that is new to some of our traditional managers. But for the more progressive leaders in an organization, for those that can sense the benefit of that, what you have are an increasing number of people who are not just giving way to staff networks, but they are proactively supporting them. And by investing in those staff networks, what they're really doing is they're investing in the best that people have to offer. So I think the relationship in how it drives goals is that it becomes a space where people can reconnect with their best self. And by doing that, they can then offer their best to the organization.
Super. Thanks so much for that, Rob. And I suppose further to that, when staff are making the case for a staff network when approaching senior management, have you got any top tips for ensuring that they can engage them as sponsors and champions in furthering that cause?
Well, whether they survive as top tips when we finish this conversation, Grace, I guess it's for others listening to this to decide. I've certainly found that these sorts of things do help in articulating a strong business case for a staff network to be resourced, and not just to be resourced reactively and after the event, and not just resourced by allowing willing volunteers to get on with it. I think often that's what networks become, and that's where networks stay. I think the more progressive leaders and the more developed organizations understand that by proactively investing in staff networks, we are in fact paying into a real understanding that networks create better organizations. And so linked to back to your question about how we can win the support of senior leaders, win sponsorship, I think it's about reminding all of us that networks do provide a space within organizations for people to be authentic and to bring all of themselves into the workplace. And once you get into that stream, you learn how to do it elsewhere in the organization. It is about increasing the creativity of thought. You know, often what we find in organizations is that groups form that think the same, act the same, and they start recruiting in their own image. They start providing for people who behave and talk and act like them. It's almost a human instinct. What networks offer is almost an antidote, if I may say it at this time, but an antidote to groupthink, because what you have is that diversity of thought, and you give it room and space to flourish and grow and infect the rest of the organization, and to prevent you from going down one track, but reminding ourselves that there are multiple tracks, and that we come up with the best idea when we have that neurodiversity, but when we have that diversity of thought in the space. So let's not end up with one type of leader, but rather let's have that diversity of thought in that space. And I think that appeals to potential sponsors, knowing that there's a real understanding that the best ideas are not the preserve of one type of person. You know, it wasn't that long ago, Grace, that organizations used to think, and some still do, but the majority of organizations used to think that we get our talent from university graduates. And we do get talent from university graduates, but that's not the only place that we can get talent from. And very often what we come to an appreciation of is that you don't have to have traveled this narrow path to leadership and only that path. There are multiple ways in which people of real talent and ability can come together to form that. And I think that appeals to potential sponsors. I think that when potential sponsors understand and appreciate that networks that are resourced are there to align themselves with what the organization is there to do and to help lift the organization to a higher place. And often the members of that network have a lived experience and a proximity to members of the community and those that we're serving, that they can offer insight, that they can offer real innovation and creativity about what they're there to do. So for example, I think if you were to speak to some of my colleagues at the Home Office and talk about what needs to happen now following, for example, Windrush, it is absolutely of paramount importance that we have a diversity of thought in that space when we are looking to develop policy that addresses the concern about previous policy that has fallen short. Mm-hmm. Let us acknowledge that the way we developed policy before, with this almost organizational myopia that prevented us from seeing and feeling what goes on for other members of our community. And read the same for gender, read the same for people with a disability, read the same for our friends from the LGBT and Q community, read the same for those spaces. And that is why any progressive sponsor will want to hear from what I call the intrinsic owners of the issues. If you want to know how to deliver on race equality, let us have people from different race and ethnicities in that creative space. And in the case often talked about when we are looking at race equality, and let us consider some of the present time with the disproportionate impact on the BAME community, the Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, as a result of COVID and the coronavirus. It must be right that we engage with those Black staff networks, those BAME staff networks, whatever they may be called in the organization, but we must have Black, Asian and minority ethnic people involved in that discussion and part of the decision-making process. And any sponsor that can appreciate the value of having intrinsic owners amplify that underrepresented voice is onto a winner. I think what we've got now, Grace, is a time in our evolution around networks, a crossroads almost, that many of us are appreciating. We are appreciating that staff networks add value. They add value. They're not just a nice to have. They're not just a box that can be ticked that says, oh, we're in for that award because we've got a staff network. As great as some awards can be, I'm not anti-awards. I'm really, I guess, anti anyone that looks to call inside a process that ticks a box that ends up with an award purely for getting an award's sake. What I am saying is, for the progressive sponsor, when you appreciate that staff networks add value, the question you're left with then is, how much value do I want to add? How much do I want to invest in this network proactively? You know, how bold do I want to be? How brave am I in taking that network to the next level, in professionalizing, professionalizing our staff networks. Let's do staff networks. Imagine this. Let's do staff networks on purpose. Imagine if we did that. Imagine if we did staff networks. If we started on a blank sheet of paper with staff networks in the middle. Imagine where we might get to. We invest in them. We follow through with a return on investment. We are totally aligned with staff goals. Oh my goodness. There is an incredible power in staff networks to transform organizations, to lift them to a higher level. And progressive sponsors can see that.
Super. Really fantastic insights. Thank you so much, Rob.
You're welcome.